I never thought I'd be here writing about it, but after what happened that night, I need to share. It was a regular Friday. I was watching my favorite show on the local channel. It was nothing special, just one of those live debates a bit awkward, but I liked to follow. Everything was normal until, out of nowhere, the screen blinked several times, as if the signal was failing. At first, I thought it was just a power outage or technical problem, but then the transmission came back. Only it wasn't the program. The image was distorted, full of noise, and right in the middle of the screen appeared a masked figure. The mask was strange, like a mixture of porcelain and leather, with exaggerated eyes and a smile that seemed cut by a knife. For a few seconds, I was waiting for someone to agree that maybe the presenter will return or the station cut to the commercials, but nothing happened. The figure stood there, motionless, looking directly at the camera, while a low and disturbing sound, something between a hum and a breath, echoed through the speakers. When I finally started to speak, the voice was distorted, almost metallic, and the first sentence that came out of me froze. "You saw what you did not deviate from." It wasn't just what he said, it was the way. It was as if he wasn't talking to everyone who was playing, but directly to me. I felt my chest tighten. It didn't make sense, but it seemed so personal, as if someone had broken into my home and was watching me on the TV. I remained paralyzed, unable to turn my eyes away from the screen. The figure continued to speak, but the words were disconnected, almost like a puzzle. He mentioned numbers, data, and phrases that make no sense. Something like, "The fifth is below, but the seventh never saw the sun." I tried to understand, but I could only feel the discomfort growing. There was something wrong with the way the image trembled, as if the figure was there caught between reality and the TV signal. The worst was the silence in the house. It seemed that everything around me had stopped. Nor the normal street noises, or my neighbors snoring passed through that moment. And then came a phrase that made me get up from the couch in a hop. "If you're listening to this, it's too late." I ran to get the remote, desperate to change the channel, but no button works. The figure was still there, motionless, and it seemed that the eyes of the mask were changing. I can't explain, but I was sure they were looking at me, not the camera. I started sweating cold, went to the TV and pulled the cable from the wall, but even when turned off, the screen still showed that distorted image. That's when the sound changed. A shrill noise invaded the room, like an electronic scream. I plugged my ears, but it seemed that the sound was inside my head. The figure then leaned her head slowly to one side, and I swear I heard a muffled laugh coming from somewhere behind me. I turned immediately, with my heart beating so hard that it seemed like it was going to come out of my mouth. There was no one in the room, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Ran to the window, thinking it was maybe some reflection or light trick coming from outside, but the street was strangely deserted. It was as if the whole world had stopped along with that transmission. Back to the TV, which continued displaying the masked figure, now closer to the camera. I can't explain how, but it seemed that he had advanced a few centimeters every time I blinked. I wanted to scream, ask for help, but who would believe something like that? Suddenly the figure started to repeat something, like a kind of mantra. "You open the door. You open the door." The words began to echo, first on TV, then in the whole room, as if they came from every corner. I tried to ignore it, but there was something strange in those words. They were not just a warning, they were an accusation. And the most terrifying, I felt it was true. My mind began to rummage through recent memories, looking for something I could have done. A strange sight, a video you shouldn't have watched, but nothing made sense. It was when a low, drawn sound began to come from the corridor as slow steps approached. My breath stuck in my throat. Those steps, there was no one else at home. My whole body was paralyzed, but my mind begged to run. The sound was rhythmic, as if anyone were walking on purpose, wanting to be heard. Each step seemed to come closer, and then stopped, exactly at the entrance of the room. I looked at the door, hoping to see someone, but it was empty. Still, that feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I looked back at the TV, and the masked figure was now completely still, but something had changed. Around the mask, like a blur in the transmission, something seemed to move. A shadow that made no sense being there. It was at this moment that the lights blinked, and everything in the house was completely silent. The TV finally went out, and for a second, I thought it was over. But when I stepped back, almost tripping nervously, I heard a heavy breath. It was not mine. It was as if someone was right next to me. My whole body froze, and I forced myself to turn around, waiting. I don't know what, but there was nothing there, only the emptiness of the room. Still, the breath kept on, getting stronger and stronger, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. I plugged my ears, but it didn't help. It was like the sound was inside me. That's when I heard the clearest sound of all. A voice, almost a whisper, but with a clarity that cut through the air like a knife, you saw. Now they know. That broke something in me. Without thinking, I ran out of the room, tripping on furniture and almost falling in a hurry to get to the front door. I didn't mind getting the keys or locking the house. I just wanted to get out of there. When I finally reached the street, the world seemed normal. Cars passing, people walking, life following as if nothing had happened. But for me, nothing was normal. I came home the next day after spending the night on a friend's couch. What's weird? The TV was off as I had left it, but the cable was still pulled, and the screen was cracked. A perfect crack, like a spider web, right in the center. Since then, I have never watched television. Don't know what that was or if anyone else saw the same thing, but one thing I do know. Sometimes things that seem harmless, like a TV show, can be the door to something no one should see. Deciphering the mask code. It all started with that program that was interrupted out of nowhere. I don't usually watch a lot of TV, but that night, I was sitting on the couch after a tiring day. The program was just a local newspaper, of those that no one gives much attention to. Suddenly, the screen froze and began to show blurry images, accompanied by a strange sound, almost like an old radio interference. At first I thought it was just a technical problem, but soon realized that there was something very wrong. The audio started to change, as if someone was trying to speak, but the voice was distorted and difficult to understand. When the image brightened, there it was, the masked figure. It seemed to be in a dark place with a dim lighting, almost theatrical. The mask was bizarre, full of grotesque details, and there was something about it that looked wrong, as if it were alive in some way. The figure stood there, standing, staring at the camera, while a repetitive metallic sound was playing in the background. I didn't know if I was more scared or curious, so I took my phone and started recording, because something inside me said that nobody would believe it if I told it later. It was then that the messages began. At first, they were loose words, flashing on the screen. Watch, do not trust, they know. Then numbers appeared, whole sequences of digits that changed too fast for me to keep up. I was so hypnotized that I only realized something was wrong when the sound of the TV stopped completely. It was as if the silence had been swallowed by the whole room. My breath was the only thing I could hear, and panic started to take over. After the sound stopped, the TV screen blinked and stalled, but the numbers continued to appear. I paused the recording on my phone and, without even thinking straight, took a picture of the screen. It was at this moment that something strange happened. For a fraction of a second, the masked figure seemed to move. I know how that sounds, but I swear I saw her head lean slightly, almost as if she was watching me. Terrified, I turned off the TV on the remote control, but the numbers were still there, as if the device had gained life of its own. That's when I decided I needed to do something. Took my notebook and started looking for any reference to transmission interruptions, codes, anything that explained it. The only thing I found were some old posts, people talking about something similar, but nothing concrete. While I was researching, I decided to take a closer look at the picture I took from the TV. It was then that I noticed something that wasn't there before. Among the numbers, there was a sequence that seemed out of place. 38.7129 minus 94.6910. I took a second to understand what it meant. They were coordinates. My heart popped. I tried to convince myself that it was a coincidence, that it didn't make sense to have been directed at me, but I couldn't get away from the idea that I had to figure out what it was. I decided to play the coordinates on Google Maps, and the place that appeared was even more disturbing, an abandoned rural property in the middle of nowhere. I don't know what gave me the courage to continue, but curiosity was beginning to overcome fear. I researched more about the location of the coordinates, but there was not much information. Some old photos show a barn falling apart and what appeared to be a partially burned house. There was no record of recent residents, no known stories, at least nothing I could find online. The more I looked at those images, the more it bothered me. There was a detail in one of the photos of the barn, like a shadow in the background, that looked familiar. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but the shape reminded me of the masked figure I had seen on TV. The idea that the two things could be connected began to consume me. After a while, I realized that I could not think of anything else. I had to know what it was, even if it meant exposing myself to something I didn't understand. I posted an anonymous post on an online mystery forum, describing what had happened and sharing the TV photo and coordinates. I expected someone to laugh at me or say it was an elaborate prank, but the reaction was completely different. The answers began to appear almost immediately. One person commented that he had also seen something similar, but on a different channel and months before. Another said the coordinates led to places that had already appeared in reports of mysterious disappearances. The idea that it was bigger than I imagined started to panic me. The forum posts got more and more strange. Some people said the numbers were part of a larger code, something that had already come up in similar broadcasts across the country. Others warned me not to investigate further, saying that they do not like being found. This only made me more nervous. Who were they? Was someone using these transmissions to send real messages, or was it just a joke? Before I could process everything, I received a private message from a profile with no photo and a generic name. The text said, "You saw what you should not. Erase everything." It was enough to make my heart race. Was it coincidence, or someone really had an eye on me? I ignored the message and went back to the main post, but something strange happened. The topic I had created simply disappeared, as if it never existed. My photos, my texts, everything. That was the last straw. Turned off the computer, but the feeling of being watched only worsened. I started to hear noises inside the house, small pops, as if someone was walking around the rooms. I went to check, but everything seemed normal. Still, that feeling that something was wrong didn't leave me. I went back to the room, and that's when I saw it. The TV was on again, but I was sure I had turned it off. On the screen, the masked figure was back, still, but with a new detail. The coordinate that I had seen before was now written in Garifay's letters at the bottom of the screen. My body locked in time. I had not turned on the TV, and the coordinate written there was the same as I had found before. The masked figure remained still, but it looked different. Something in the contours of the mask seemed more irregular, as if it was shaved, or maybe it was the light. I do not know. I didn't have the courage to approach, but I couldn't take my eyes off the screen either. It was then that a sound began to come out of the TV, low at first, but getting louder and louder. It was a heavy, almost suffocating breath mixed with that same metallic hum I had heard in the first transmission. The sound seemed to fill the whole room, as if it came from all sides. Suddenly the coordinate disappeared, and the screen was completely black. I thought I was done, but before I could move, a text began to appear, letter by letter, as if someone were typing live. I asked closer than you imagine. I felt my breath stop. It wasn't just the text, it was the way it seemed personal, as if it was directed specifically at me. The sound of breathing ceased, and in absolute silence I heard a noise outside the room window, as if something or someone had run past. I walked up there, slowly, and looked out. There was nothing but the dark street, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Went back inside, closed all the doors and windows, and locked myself in the room. In the room, everything was dark and quiet, but I could not feel safe. I locked the door and sat on the floor, trying to understand what was happening. My heart was still pounding, and I couldn't stop looking at the screen of my phone, waiting for, I don't know, something. But the worst was when I realized that the internet signal and cell network had disappeared. I tried to restart the device, but nothing worked. It was as if I had been disconnected from the whole world. At that moment, the TV in the room was again making noise. Even with the bedroom door closed, I could hear the muffled sound of heavy breathing and electronic hum. The problem is that this time it didn't stop on TV. A soft knock came from my bedroom door. 3 slow, spaced tones. My whole body was frozen. I could not ignore what had just happened. I knew I was alone at home, but the sound was unmistakable. 3 more beats, now a little louder. My mind was spinning, trying to decide whether to open the door or hide somewhere. I decided to stay where I was, holding my breath, waiting for that thing to go away. But then the TV suddenly turned off and silence returned, even more oppressive than before. I stood there, sitting on the floor, trying not to move or make any noise, but every second felt like an eternity. When I thought things had settled down, I heard something outside the bedroom window. It was fast, as if someone was scratching the glass, but enough to make me freeze. The curtain was closed, and I didn't have the courage to open it. The idea that something could be watching me from the other side was unbearable. Then, as if he had heard my thoughts, the window began to shake, as if someone was trying to force it. My instinct told me to run, but I had nowhere to go. The only safe place seemed to be inside the room, even with everything going on. Picked up the phone once more, but still no signal. Not knowing what else to do, I started recording an audio, as if it was a record of what was happening. That's when something changed. The sound of breathing came back, but this time it wasn't coming from the TV or window. It was coming from inside the room. I didn't know if I was imagining, but I could feel it, almost as if someone were a few meters away from me. My whole body was paralyzed, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't even turn my head to look. I don't know how long I was there, motionless, but it seemed like an eternity. The sound of breathing was so close that it was impossible to ignore. Even then, I could not see anything. It was as if the air around me was heavy, impossible to breathe. Then, out of nowhere, the breath stopped. The silence was so absolute I could hear my heart tapping on the ears. Thought it was finally over, but then something happened that still gives me chills just to remember. A voice, low and cold, whispered right near my ear, "You should not have looked." I threw myself against the bedroom door, trying to get out of there anyway. I didn't care what was outside anymore. When I opened the door, the whole house was silent, as if nothing had happened. I went to the room and turned off the TV. The screen was blacking out, finally. I left home that night without even taking my keys or shoes, and only came back the next day. Since then, I have never watched television. I can't explain what that was, but I'm sure it wasn't normal. All I know is that, even today when I'm alone, sometimes I still feel that breath, as if someone was right there watching. The figure knew too much. I've always been the kind of person who leaves the TV on as a backdrop while doing other things. But that night, what happened made me rethink it forever. Was showing a local program very silly, of those that we do not pay attention to. I was washing the dishes when I noticed that the background music had stopped suddenly. When I looked at the TV, the transmission was static with that annoying squeak. I thought it was just a signal problem, so I went back to wash the dishes. Only that, out of nowhere, the squeak was replaced by a low and distorted voice, as if someone were talking behind a mask or through an old microphone. I went to the room and saw that the image was starting to change. At first, it seemed just a mess of pixels, but soon a masked figure appeared on the screen, standing, staring at me. I can't explain what I felt at that moment, but it was as if something very wrong was happening. The mask was simple but disturbing. It seemed to be made of some rough material, almost as if it had been improvised. The figure did not move, but the voice kept on saying things I could not understand. Then the voice changed. It became clearer, as if he was talking directly to me. And what I heard made me freeze. "You left the kitchen light on." My heart popped. It was true. The light was on. I looked back immediately into the kitchen, and it was exactly as I had left it. But how could that be? How did the figure on TV know? For a moment, I was trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was some kind of joke, a technological trick, something transmitted to scare people. But then the figure spoke again, and this time the voice sounded more direct, almost annoying. "You are still in blue pajamas. Are you comfortable?" I froze. I looked at myself, and there I was, in blue pajamas, as if it were a casual conversation between two acquaintances. It didn't make sense. There was no camera in my house, nothing that could justify what was happening. I took the remote control and started to push all the buttons, trying to change the channel or turn off the TV, but nothing worked. The figure was still there, immobile, with that mask that seemed to judge me in some way. I started to sweat cold, the feeling of being watched getting stronger and stronger. It was when the figure tilted his head slightly to the side, and the voice came back, but now more serious, almost whispered, "You know what I'm talking about, don't you?" I didn't know. I had no idea what that meant, but the question made something in the back of my mind move, as if it was trying to remind me of something I didn't want. My phone was next to the couch, so I grabbed it and tried to record the broadcast, but the camera only showed the screen of the TV completely black. It was not possible. I was looking at the figure for the details of that mask, but the phone did not pick up anything. It was as if what I was seeing wasn't real, but I knew it was. As I tried to process what was happening, the figure began to say even more specific things. "You forgot to close the room window." Immediately I looked to the side, and indeed the window was open, as if it had been left like this on purpose. My heart was racing. It was not only the fact that she knew, but the way she said, almost casual, as if she were commenting something obvious. Before I could react, the voice continued, "Why do you still keep that red notebook? You know it's no use." It made me freeze. There was only one person in the world who knew about that notebook, and she had been dead for years. It was an old notebook that I kept in the back of my closet, full of notes from a dark period of my life. It was not something I mentioned or even opened. How was that possible? My mind was a mess. Took the phone again and tried to find some explanation, typing random words in the hope of finding something about strange transmissions or masked figures. But even before completing the search, my phone crashed and the screen went black. I turned my eyes to the TV, and the figure was still there, but now it seemed closer. I know it sounds crazy, but it seemed like she had approached the camera, as if trying to get off the screen. Suddenly, the voice got louder, almost screaming, "You know what you need to do. Close the window. Take the notebook." It was as if he was giving me orders, and I did not know whether to obey was the best or the worst thing to do. I don't know what pushed me, but I got up, almost stumbling, and went to the window. Closing it seemed the most logical thing to do, as if it would protect me from something I could not understand. As I locked the window latch, I had a distinct sense that someone was watching me outside. I looked, but only saw the darkness, the reflection of the room in the glass. My body was shaking, and my mind was screaming for me to get out of there, but something stronger pulled me back to the TV. When I turned to look again, the figure was gone. The screen showed only static, but the background sound continued, a low hum, almost like a breath. That strange silence made me realize that the red notebook was still in the closet, as the figure had mentioned. I didn't want to take it, but curiosity was eating me up. So with slow steps, I went to the closet, opened the door, and pulled out the notebook. It was exactly where I remembered, covered in dust, but something was different. When I opened it, I realized there were pages that I had not written. What was there wasn't mine. It was scribbled messages, phrases like, "You shouldn't have left that behind, and they know now." Every word made my stomach turn. I didn't know who had put it there or how, but everything seemed to be connected to that figure, to that transmission. I couldn't move. The sound of scratches on the door was rhythmic, slow, almost deliberate, as if whoever was on the other side wanted me to hear every movement. My mind was running in 1,000 directions, trying to find some logic in everything. With my breath stopped, I approached the door, trying to see through the peephole. But before he got there, the sound suddenly stopped, and a heavy silence took over the house. I looked around, trying to find some sign of what was going on, but the only thing that kept on was the low hum coming from the TV. With my hand shaking, I decided to open the door. I know it sounds insane, but at that moment, it seemed like the only way to end it was by facing whatever was out there. When I turned the handle and opened slowly, I only found the empty corridor. There was no one there, but a strange feeling invaded me. The air was cold, as if someone had just passed by. It was then that I noticed something on the floor, right at the door, a torn sheet of the notebook. Don't know how she got there, but I immediately recognized the handwriting that wasn't mine. It said, "You know what to do. They are coming." I held that sheet in my hands for a time that seemed endless. The message was clear, but I had no idea what "they are coming" meant or what I should do. The empty corridor only increased the feeling that something was very wrong. I closed the door tightly, locking all the locks, and returned to the room, but the atmosphere in the house seemed heavier, almost suffocating. The TV was still on, with the masked figure staring at me, but now there was something written at the bottom of the screen. Last chance. I knew that somehow this was a warning, but I didn't understand what it was. Then all the lights in the house flickered and went out at once, leaving only the cold glare of the TV lighting up the room. That's when I heard steps. They didn't come from the corridor, nor from the street. They were inside my house. Heavy steps moving slowly, as if someone is exploring each room, getting closer and closer. Locked myself in the room again, with my notebook and paper in my hands, trying to think about what to do. The steps stopped outside the door of the room. The figure on TV whispered a last, clear and cold sentence. "It's too late." Then everything stopped. The lights came back, the TV turned off by itself, and silence took over. I don't know what happened that night, or who, or what, was after me. Since then, I moved home, threw away the notebook, and avoided anything related to that day. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I still hear the footsteps, as if I never really left. Names, coordinates, and disappearances. That day, I was at home watching the Zapiendo channels on TV, without paying much attention to what was going on. I ended up stopping on a local program, these small-town news that always have a story half boring. Everything seemed normal until, out of nowhere, the transmission was interrupted. The screen went black for a few seconds, and I thought it was just a signal problem. But when the picture came back, it was something completely different. The masked figure appeared, static in the middle of the screen, with a completely dark background. The mask was almost without expression, but still disturbing, as if hide something you didn't want to see. I thought it was some trick or signal invasion, because instead of cutting to commercials, the figure started talking. Only that her voice was distorted, metallic, almost inhuman. I was intrigued, but it was what she said that made me freeze. At first, it was just numbers and words without meaning, as if she were reciting a code. But suddenly the numbers stopped, and she started to say names. And that's when the discomfort became panic. The second name mentioned was someone I knew. Not personally, but from old news. A teenager from my city who disappeared more than 10 years ago. At the time, I thought it was a coincidence, but then the figure continued, mentioning other names, and they all sounded familiar in some way. It was as if my mind started to connect the dots. All were people who had disappeared, and not only from my city. Some were from nearby places, others from regions that I only recognized by reports. And at the end of each name, the figure recited a coordinate. I didn't understand what it meant, but I had a feeling that there was more to it than just numbers. My curiosity was greater than fear at that moment. I took my cell phone and started to write down the names and coordinates. The pattern was clear: name, pause, coordinate. It didn't make sense, but it seemed meticulously planned. When the figure finished reciting a sequence, the image was static for a few seconds, and I swear I saw the masked face move slightly, as if he had noticed that I was writing. The sound came back, and another sequence of names and coordinates began. It was like a macabre catalog. I searched for one of the names on Google quickly and confirmed what I already suspected. It was a missing person. The website that appeared was from a local newspaper with a photo and details about the case. My heart shot. This was not a prank, it could not be. When the broadcast finally went off the air, the TV went back to the show I was watching before, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't stop looking at the numbers on my phone. I played one of the coordinates on Google Maps just to test it out, and the result was scary. A completely isolated place, a forest that was less than an hour from my house. The satellite image showed a clearing in the middle of the forest, with no apparent trails or buildings. Something about that discovery made me tremble. I felt that if I went there, I would find something I did not want to see, but curiosity was eating me. Then, with my hands shaking, I began to look for the other coordinates, one by one. All were taken to equally remote and abandoned places. I didn't know what to do with that information. Part of me wanted to pretend that nothing had happened, but another part knew that if I didn't invest, it would never get out of my head. I decided to share what I saw on a local forum, describing the broadcast and posting the coordinates I wrote down. I expected someone to say it was a joke or some bizarre marketing action, but the answers I got only increased my fear. Some people recognized the names and confirmed that they were from missing persons of different times and places. Others said the coordinates led to locations where bodies had already been found, cases still unresolved. One person anonymously sent a direct message. "If you saw this, they're already watching you." That message made me panic. I knew it could be someone just trying to scare me, but after what I saw, it seemed plausible. I decided to close the forum and delete the post, but curiosity still did not leave me alone. I took the car that same night and drove to the place indicated by the nearest coordinate. The path was dark and winding, and the forest seemed to swallow the road as I approached. When I got to the exact point, I parked and stayed a few minutes inside the car, thinking if I should even leave. But something in me said I needed to see. I took a flashlight and started walking towards the clearing that I had seen on the map. The silence there was almost deafening, as if even the sounds of nature were absent. When I entered the clearing, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was a heavy metallic odor, something that immediately made me sick. The lantern only lit up small pieces of the ground, but I could see that there was something scattered around there, like remnants of objects or maybe clothes. My heart was racing, and the feeling that I should not be there got stronger with each step. After a few meters, I found what seemed to be an old backpack thrown among the vegetation. The canvas was torn and covered with dirt, but it was impossible not to notice that it seemed to have been there for years. My stomach turned when I saw that inside the backpack there were papers faded and a notebook with notes that did not make sense. Some pages were covered with scribbles, while others had simple and disturbing drawings like human forms surrounded by masked figures. I didn't want to touch anything anymore, but something told me there was more out there. I kept walking slowly, lighting the ground, until I saw marks on the ground. They were not recent footprints, but signs that someone or something had dragged large objects through the place. It was a shallow hole, partially covered by leaves and branches. Inside there was what appeared to be a black plastic bag. I didn't have the courage to approach to confirm what it was, but everything in me said to leave there as soon as possible. I came back to the car almost running, feeling that at any moment something or someone would reach me. I arrived at the car with my hands shaking so much that I could barely put the key in the ignition. When I finally got the start, I accelerated without looking back. The road seemed even darker and claustrophobic, as if the forest was closing the way behind me. I just wanted to get home, but the feeling of being followed did not leave me alone. When I entered the city, I began to feel a sense of relief, but this did not last long. I parked in front of my house, went inside and locked all the doors and windows. I was still panting, trying to process everything when my phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. I opened it, and the content made me freeze, a photo taken from the clearing where I was. In the photo, I could see clearly the hole that I had found, but this time it was empty. In the place of the bag, there was an object that wasn't there before. The backpack I had seen earlier thrown, but now completely clean, as if it had never been left in the woods. The message had only one sentence: "You know where to look now." I did not sleep that night. I deleted all the coordinates of my phone, but the regret of having investigated that was never gone. Even today, sometimes I feel that someone is watching me, as if he has taken something from that clearing with me. I have not returned to the site, and I hope no one else will. Some mysteries should not be solved. The location of the sign. It all started when I got stuck with a dark forum that discussed strange signals intercepted on specific TV. It was not something I used to follow, but the topic was so intriguing that it stuck me. People were sharing stories about a masked figure who appeared out of nowhere on local channels, always with distorted images and enigmatic messages. One of the posts said that someone had traced the source of the signal to an abandoned place outside the city. The guidelines were there, visible, and for some reason deciding to write them down. It looked like it, but something inside me said I needed to see it up close, as if the words in the posts were a calling. That same day, I took the car and followed the coordinates. The road was long, and the further I got away from the city, the more the environment seemed to change. The houses gave way to open fields, and then to a dense forest. GPS indicated that I was getting close, but there was no paved road, just a dirt trail that seemed to lead nowhere. When I finally parked, I saw that the road continued on foot. The clarity where the coordinates pointed was surrounded by trees so tall and thick that the sun barely passed. The place was desolate, and the silence was almost unnatural, as if even birds avoided that area. I was already sorry, but something told me it was too late to go back. As I walked down the narrow trail, I started to notice strange things. There were pieces of rusty metal scattered on the floor, as if they were remnants of old equipment. Some were partially buried, while others were recently dumped. But what really caught my attention was a small tower, almost hidden among the trees. It was made of a material that looked like steel, but was completely corroded, as if left to rot for decades. At the top of the tower, there was an antenna tilted to the side, hanging precariously. I had seen images of transmission towers before, but this was different. There was something in it that did not make sense, as if it had been built with parts that did not match. As I approached, I noticed that there was a sound coming from the tower. It was a low and constant buzzing, something I could almost feel in my chest. The sound seemed to increase as I approached, as if it was reacting to my presence. Suddenly I saw a smaller structure next to the tower, half hidden by vegetation. It was a kind of metal shelter, with a rusty door that was half open. Curiosity overcame me, and I approached slowly. The first thing I noticed was a strong smell, something between mold and burnt metal, that made me choke. I pushed the door carefully, and inside there was old equipment, consoles with buttons and levers that seemed to have come out of a laboratory from the 60s. But the strangest was the monitor in the corner of the room. It was on, showing a screen full of static, but I swear something moved in it for a second. I stood still for a moment, looking at the monitor as if it was going to reveal something to me. The static continued, but there was something strange in the patterns. It seemed that the image blinked, as if trying to form something. Suddenly, a high-pitched sound burst through the speakers, making me take a step back. It was like an interference, but after a few seconds, the static on the screen began to change. A figure appeared. It was not clear, but it looked human, with a face covered by something that very much reminded me of the mask I had read in the forum reports. My heart popped. The figure was motionless, but the environment seemed to vibrate with the hum coming from the tower. And then it moved. It was a minimal movement, but enough to freeze me. Before I could react, the monitor went off, and the shelter became completely silent. I turned quickly, as if expecting someone to come in after me, but there was nothing. Only the weak wind passed through the trees outside. I took a deep breath and tried to convince myself that it was just a defect in the old equipment, but the feeling that something was wrong wasn't happening. I decided to explore the room more and found something that made my stomach turn. A pile of old, yellowed documents was playing on a table in the corner. Opened one of the papers and saw a list of names, all data, with coordinates on the side. They were different from those that brought me there. I recognized one of the names immediately. It was from a missing person who had been mentioned on the forum. My mind began to spin. That could not be a coincidence. I took some of the papers and flipped them quickly, and they all seemed to follow the same pattern: names, dates, coordinates. It was like a record of something, but the purpose was far from clear. The worst was the growing feeling that these documents should not be there, as if I were trespassing something forbidden. My instinct was to leave, but my hands kept leafing through the papers, almost as if something forced me to stay. It was then that I found a map, drawn by hand, with marks that coincided with some of the coordinates. Next to each mark, there was a short word or phrase, such as recovered or not found. I didn't know what that meant, but the word recovered gave me chills. While processing everything, a sound echoed through the shelter. It was not the hum of the tower, but something heavier, like steps coming from outside. I froze. The sound was closer and closer, rhythmic and slow, as if someone or something was around the structure. My heart seemed to be going out of my mouth. I turned off the flashlight immediately and remained silent, trying to hear better. The steps stopped, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I knew I wasn't alone. I took the papers and the map almost without thinking and put them in my backpack. I decided to get out of there as soon as possible, but before reaching the door, something on the monitor moved again. The masked figure was back, but now she seemed to be looking directly at me. When I finally got home, I locked the door and went straight to the kitchen, trying to calm down. My body was shaking so much that I could barely hold a glass of water. After a few minutes, I decided to look inside the backpack to confirm that the papers were still there. Opened the zipper with trembling hands, and to my surprise, everything was intact. The documents, the map, even the notes. It didn't make sense. How could I have seen the map in the hand of that figure? It was then something caught my attention. In the corner of the map, there was something I had not noticed before. A dirty hand mark, as if someone had held the paper recently. The problem was that this mark was not there when I took the map. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise in the house sounded louder, more threatening, as if something was waiting for the right moment to appear. The next day, I decided to burn the papers, including the map. I took everything to the yard, lit a fire, and threw the documents into the fire. The flames swallowed the papers quickly, but the map was different. It took longer to burn, as if he resisted, and before disappearing completely, the same phrase that appeared on the monitor appeared in between the flames. "You should not be here." After that, everything was quiet. I never heard of the tower or the masked figure, but even today, I feel like something is watching me, waiting for me to make another mistake. A message that no one can ignore. I never really watched TV, but that night something made me turn on the machine. It was a local channel, one that nobody really pays attention to. Everything was normal until, out of nowhere, the transmission was interrupted. The screen went black for a few seconds, followed by a loud squeak that seemed to come from all the speakers in the room. I was going to turn off the TV thinking it was some signal problem when the image came back, but it was not the program that was playing before. It was a masked figure, immobile, on a completely black background. The mask was simple, but disturbing, as if it hid something I did not want to see. Her voice began to sound distorted and metallic, saying things that made no sense at first, like numbers and words disconnected. But then she stopped, and what came after changed everything. The figure tilted his head slightly, as if he was watching something, and began to speak again, but this time it was different. "You in the blue chair, are you listening to me, aren't you?" My heart popped. I was sitting in my blue chair, just like she said. For a second, I thought it was a coincidence, but the figure continued. "You think nobody knows, don't you? But I know. I saw what you did." The voice was low, almost like a whisper, but each word seemed to be loaded with an intention that I could not understand. I stood up, trying to convince myself that it was some kind of trick, but the more I thought about it, it seemed to be directed exactly at me. While I tried to understand what was happening, the figure continued talking, and what he said made my blood cold. "You hid well, but they are coming for what is theirs." It made no sense, but the tone of the voice was so direct that it seemed impossible to ignore. I looked around the room, as if looking for a camera or some equipment that could justify it, but there was nothing. The worst was when she said my name. It wasn't just the name, it was the way it was said, slow, almost mocking. "You know what I'm talking about, don't you? My name?" I froze. I didn't tell anyone, but I felt that at that moment she could see me. It was like not a TV broadcast, but a direct conversation. Desperate, I took the remote control and tried to turn off the TV, but nothing worked. I pressed all the buttons until I pulled the cable from the wall. Even so, the figure continued on the screen, now staring at me without saying a word. The breath became heavy, as if the sound was coming from inside the room. Suddenly, the image on TV was static, and a loud sound, like a constant beep, echoed through the house. Before I could do anything, the screen showed a final message: "Get ready. Tomorrow will be different." It was at this moment that I realized my house was strangely quiet, as if even the sound of the street had disappeared. The feeling that something or someone was watching me was almost unbearable. That night was one of the longest nights of my life. I tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every noise in the house seemed amplified, every shadow seemed to move. The message on TV was spinning in my head like an echo. Tomorrow will be different. I didn't know what it meant, but I was sure something was about to happen. When the sun finally rose, I tried to act normal. made coffee, opened the windows, turned on my phone, but the feeling of being watched did not go away. In the middle of the morning, I received a call from an unknown number. I answered hesitantly, but on the other side there was only silence, followed by a low sound that seemed breathing. I hung up immediately, but the fear was already consuming every part of me. The day dragged on, and nothing happened immediately, but the feeling that something was wrong grew more and more. I decided I needed to get out of the house and clear my head. I went to the market, and while I was there, I had the strange impression that someone was following me. Whenever I looked back, I could not see anyone, but the feeling of being observed was unmistakable. When I finally came home, I found something that made my stomach turn. The TV, which I had left disconnected, was on. The same masked figure was on the screen, but now she wasn't still. She seemed to be closer to the camera, almost touching the glass. And then the voice came back, clear and cold. "You thought you could run away? They already know where you are." I froze at the time. That sentence, "they already know where you are," was not just a warning, it was a sentence. I looked around the room, hoping to see something, but everything seemed normal. The TV, however, was still on, with the masked figure staring at me. Before I could do anything, the screen blinked and new words appeared. "Today is the day." My heart went wild. The message seemed so definitive that I did not know what to do. Took the phone and tried to call someone, anyone, but the screen locked and went black. The device did not respond. It was then that I heard something coming from the front door, 3 strong and spaced knocks. My first reaction was to run into the room and lock myself in. I didn't look out the window. I didn't try to see who was outside. I knew it was not someone knocking to visit me. From my room, I could hear more beats, this time faster and insistent, as if whoever was trying to force the door. I took the desk chair and put it against the door, trying to protect me. But then everything was quiet. Silence was so oppressive that it seemed to scream. I looked around, and my attention went to the TV in the room. She was off, but in the reflection of the dark screen, I swear I saw something moving behind me. My breath held. I didn't have the courage to turn immediately, but the feeling that something was behind me was inescapable. Took my phone, still locked, and used the screen as a mirror. I saw it almost made me drop the device. It was a tall, indistinct shadow, as if materializing in the corner of the room, but its contours were wrong, as if it was not fully human. I don't know where I got my strength, but I turned at once, ready to face anything. To my surprise, there was nothing there, just the empty room, exactly as it was before. It was then that everything stopped at once. The door stops, the feeling of being observed disappears, and silence returns to normal. The TV, both in the room and in the bedroom, did not turn on even when I tried to reconnect the cables. The next day, the only thing left of what happened was a strange and repetitive dream. The masked figure pointing to me while whispering something I could never understand. I tried to live my life, but I never forgot that night. To this day, I don't know who or what was behind it, but one thing is certain: the message wasn't to be ignored. Something or someone wanted me to know that wherever I go, they know exactly where to find me. An attempt to capture the figure. I never thought I would be writing this, but I need to share what happened. It all started with a mystery forum that I attended. Someone posted about a masked figure who appeared on TV broadcasts and left coordinates for a place where she was supposedly seen in person. The story seemed absurd, but the post gained strength, with several people commenting, and even reporting that they had seen something similar. Some said that the figure appeared in different places, always remote, as if he was running away. It was there that a group organized to investigate the location of the coordinates, an abandoned industrial building a few miles from the city. For some reason, I decided to join them. On the day marked, we were 5 people, all with lanterns, cameras, and the kind of courage that only appears when you think you are dealing with something impossible. The building was huge, with broken windows and walls covered in graffiti. It seemed like no one had stepped on it for years. The silence was frightening. Not even the sounds of the city reached there. We entered the side where the grid was cut, and the atmosphere became even heavier as we crossed the entrance. The smell of mold and rust was strong, and the air looked different, denser. Despite the nervousness, the group was focused on finding some sign of the figure. The idea of capturing something so mysterious on video motivated us to move forward. As we explored the building, I began to notice strange things. There were marks on the ground like deep scratches that seemed to extend all the way down the main corridor. One of the group members, who was in front with a camera, stopped and drew our attention to one of the walls. There, in the middle of the graffiti, was a drawing that did not seem to be made by anyone who was playing. It was a tall figure with a mask that looked deformed, almost organic, surrounded by symbols I had never seen before. The strangest thing was that the drawing seemed recent, as if someone had just done it. This made everyone more alert, and we started moving in silence, trying to pick up any sound or movement. That's when we heard it. A low sound, as if something was being dragged upstairs. The noise was slow but steady, and seemed to follow a rhythm, almost like heavy steps. The group looked at each other, and I could see that fear was beginning to take hold of everyone. Even so, we decided to climb. The iron stairs creaked with each step, and the echo made it seem as if the noise was coming from all sides. When we got to the second floor, the sound stopped. The hallway was completely dark except for the faint light from our lanterns. It was at this moment that the tension became unbearable. One of the lanterns went out, and before anyone could do anything, we heard a sound of metal falling down the corridor. All stopped at the same moment. The metallic sound echoed through the corridor as if something had been knocked down, but there was no one else there. The owner of the lantern that had been extinguished shook it frantically until the light came back. But at that moment the attention of all was already focused on the end of the corridor. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. We decided to approach slowly, with the lanterns pointed in the direction of the noise. Each step seemed harder than the previous one. When we finally arrived at the site, we saw what had fallen, an old iron bar thrown on the ground. But what left us breathless was the one next to it. Marks on the dust of the floor like long and dragged footprints, heading towards a room at the end of the corridor. One of us, the bravest, decided to enter the room first, with the camera on. The others followed, and I was the last one to enter. The room was spacious, but almost empty, except for some old furniture and a broken mirror against the wall. The light of the lanterns illuminated something in the center of the room that made my stomach turn. A piece of fabric that seemed to be from a mask, like the one described in the reports of the forum. It was torn, as if it had been forcibly torn out. Suddenly the air became heavier, and the silence was broken by a low, repetitive sound like a breath. It was so subtle that it seemed to be coming from inside the room, but no one could locate where exactly. Everyone stood still, trying to understand where that breath sound came from. I pointed my flashlight at every corner of the room, but there was nothing beyond what we had already seen. Then something caught our attention, the mirror leaning against the wall. Even broken, it seemed to reflect something that was not in the room. It was difficult to describe, but there was a shadow in the reflection that did not correspond to anyone in the group. The shadow was high, higher than any of us, and seemed to tremble slightly, as if it were about to move. One of the members, clearly terrified, tried to leave the room, but as soon as he took the first step out, the sound of breathing stopped abruptly. It was at that moment that something fell behind us, making everyone turn around at the same time. One of the old furniture had been dragged to the center of the room, but no one had touched it. Panic took hold of the group, and we started to retreat towards the door. Before leaving, a last look at the mirror left me paralyzed. The shadow had moved, and now it seemed to be looking directly at the group, even without eyes. We ran out the hall, ignoring the creaking stairs and noises that began to echo through the entire building. When we finally arrived at the exit, we realized that the hum that before came from upstairs now seemed to fill the entire building. It was almost deafening. We ran towards the car without looking back. The hum seemed to follow us, as if the building was alive and driving us away. When we arrived at the makeshift parking lot, I noticed that one of the members was not with us. It was the guy who had entered the room first. He stayed behind. At first, we thought he would soon run away too, but the minutes passed and nothing. We heard muffled screams coming from the building, but it was not possible to distinguish if it was him or something else. One of us suggested to come back for him, but no one had the courage. After a few minutes of absolute terror, we saw lights flashing in one of the windows on the second floor. It was his flashlight. Suddenly the light went out, and the hum stopped instantly. Everything was in an absurd silence, as if even the wind had stopped. It was then that the door of the building, which we had left wide open, slammed hard, closing itself. We tried to open, but seemed locked from the inside. We stood there waiting, calling for him, but we never got an answer. After an hour, we decided to go out and call for help. When we came back the next day with the police, the building looked different. The door was open, but inside everything was empty. The furniture, the mirror, even the marks on the floor had disappeared. And our friend, no one ever saw him again. To this day, we don't know what happened to him or what was really in that place. But one thing is certain: I will never come back. The mystery never ends. I started to get involved with this mystery almost casually, but it quickly took over my life. It all started when I saw a broadcast interrupted by that masked figure. At the time, I thought it was just an elaborate prank or some sort of technical mistake. But the way she stood still, just staring at me, made me uncomfortable for days. I decided to look online to see if anyone else had noticed something similar. That's when I found out it wasn't just me. There were entire forums discussing the masked figure, with reports from people from different places and times, all describing the same thing. Curiosity overtook me, and I began to investigate further, but nothing could prepare me for what I was about to discover. After weeks of reading reports, a pattern began to emerge. Some people mentioned not only the TV broadcasts, but also old photographs where the figure appeared discreetly. I thought it was overkill until someone on the forum shared a 1930s wedding photo. There she was, deep among the guests, wearing the same disturbing mask. What's strange? The figure didn't seem to fit in the context. While everyone in the photo seemed to interact with each other, she was standing, staring directly at the camera. It didn't make sense. How could someone appear at an event decades ago with the same appearance and no one seems to notice? It obsessed me. I spent hours going through online files, looking for any old image that might contain the masked figure. It wasn't easy, but I eventually found more examples. One of them was from a small-town protest in the 1910s. Again, the figure was there, in the background, near a wall, with the mask that now seemed to be engraved in my memory. The detail that scared me was that, despite being in a busy environment, no one in the photo seemed to pay attention to it. It was as if he wasn't really there, but the look of the figure was, once again, fixed in the camera. It was impossible not to feel that there was a purpose in it. The worst discovery came when I decided to go to a public archive in my city. I found a photo of a community event from the late 19th century. It was an outdoor party with children playing and adults talking. And there she was again, leaning against a tree in the background, but clear enough to make no doubt. The mask looked even more strange in the black and white photo, almost glowing, and I could swear that her body angle was wrong. I can't explain it, but it seemed like she was a bit out of place, as if she didn't obey the same laws of perspective as other people. It left me with a knot in my stomach. How could this figure be on a photo taken before the television even existed? After this discovery, things started to get even stranger. In the public archive, the librarian noticed my interest in old photos and commented casually on a curious record. He said there was a collection of older images dating from events in the city during the 18th century. Curiosity overcame fear, and I asked to see these photos. Among them, there was a detailed painting of a community fair, full of details of the people, tents, and scenery. There was the masked figure again. This time, she was near a fire, her head tilted in a way that seemed inhuman. The mask was identical, but what bothered me most was the fact that no one in the painting seemed to react to its presence. I came home that night with my head spinning. I spent hours looking at the images I had collected, magnifying every detail, trying to understand. It was not only her presence that disturbed me, but the pattern. In all the photos, the figure was always at important events, weddings, protests, celebrations. It was as if she chose specific moments, but never interacted with anyone. What really scared me was when I noticed something that I had ignored until then. In all images, no matter the angle or position of the figure, she always seemed to look directly at me, even in photos taken centuries ago. It was not possible, but it seemed personal. From then on, I started having trouble sleeping. The feeling that it was more than a coincidence did not leave me alone. I spent days analyzing every detail of the photos and paintings, looking for any connection or more specific pattern. It was then that I realized something even more disturbing. In one of the oldest photos from the 19th century, there was an object on the ground near the figure, a piece of paper partially visible. I zoomed in as much as I could, and even with the low quality, I could see a symbol. It was the same symbol that was scribbled on the background of some more recent photos. The same symbol I had seen on the forums, described by other people who had experiences with the figure. I decided to go back to the public archive, but this time the librarian said that I could not access those photos anymore. He seemed uncomfortable, almost nervous, as if something had made me change my mind. It only increased my paranoia. I started hearing strange noises at home during the night, like steps upstairs, even though I live alone. My computer also started acting strangely, turning off by itself or displaying unexpected black screens. The last straw was when I found a new photo in my email. I don't know who sent it, but it was from a park in my city taken a few days ago. And there was the masked figure, standing by a tree with his head tilted, just like in the old pictures. After receiving that picture in the email, my paranoia reached an unbearable level. I looked out of the window, hoping to see something, but the street was empty. Even so, I could not get rid of the feeling of being watched. I decided to leave home that night and stay in a hotel, thinking that maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. However, on the way there, while waiting at the traffic light, I looked in the rear-view mirror and almost lost control of the car. Across the street, in the dim light of a pole, was the masked figure. Immobile but perfectly visible. I knew it wasn't possible, but it was her. I was paralyzed for a few seconds before speeding up, ignoring the green light. Arriving at the hotel, I locked the door of the room and tried to convince myself that all this was a coincidence, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning, when I opened my phone, there was a new notification. It was a photo sent from an unknown number. This time, it was a picture taken outside my hotel, exactly from the window of my room. The photo showed no one, just the hotel building under a gray sky, but the message that came along made me freeze. The mystery never ends. Since then, I can't escape the feeling that the figure is still around, watching, waiting. I don't know what she wants, but I know it's not over.